Anyway, Daniel chapter 8. I apologize ahead of time because this is going to be probably the first part of this, a little bit of a history lesson. And so I'm sorry for that, but that's... Did you know that there's history in the Bible? And sometimes even though we don't like it, I guess, and we want to just kind of bypass those chapters, they're essential somehow. And it's really interesting because when I was a kid and into my early teens, I hated history, science, I hated English, and I hated math. And, you know, I have learned that all four of those are absolutely essential to understanding the Bible. And I wish on a regular basis that when I was in school, I would have paid more attention to those things, because then I wouldn't have to try to be learning some of it now. Now, I shouldn't say that I didn't like history. I loved history, just not the stuff they were teaching us in school. My grandpa was a World War II vet and fought the Japanese and everything like that. So he shot down kamikaze planes and all that stuff. So what kid doesn't like hearing about that part of history? That's fun stuff. And then he used to watch the Discovery Channel all the time and got me addicted to it. But that was back when the Discovery Channel, Animal Planet, the History Channel, and all that was the Discovery Channel before they each had their own station. And it was more than just reality shows and stuff like that, like they do now. And so I enjoyed. But reading out of a book, history, that was foreign to me. And I didn't even like reading when I was a kid. I didn't like it at all. And then after I got saved and started getting into the Bible, it was like, I need to read more. And when I was in college, they started a library, and I practically gave them the library, getting rid of the books that I had collected. And so what's in my office is nothing, not even a pin drop in the stuff that I've had and read over the past and stuff like that. So I love history. There are some guys that I talk to, they still don't like history. They don't like reading anything else but the Bible. They're the super spiritual kind. And so they come up with some very strange ideas. I was reading in one commentary this week as I was studying it, for Revelation on Wednesday nights, and he got talking about Daniel chapter 7. In Daniel chapter 7, you see the four beasts, and there was the lion with the wings, and then there was the bear, and then the leopard that had the four wings, and then you had the great beast then afterwards. And he was saying, well, if you look at the image in chapter 2, that was four kingdoms, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and then Rome. And then there had to be four more kingdoms that come, the last one being the kingdom of the Antichrist. And so he said, well, to make up those 8, the four beasts in Daniel chapter 7 have to be for different things than the image in chapter 2. And so he said, well, the lion out of the sea, that was England, and then the bear was Russia, and then, of course, you got to get in there somewhere, the leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads, that's America. And where do you get that from? And if you just read a history book, it would be so clear and so simple. Well, actually, if you just turn the page to the next chapter, Daniel chapter 8, you would understand exactly who he was talking about in those images, because Daniel chapter 7, as we mentioned last week, gives us kind of a miniature snapshot of the history of the world from the beginning of the time of the Gentiles, with Israel being in Babylon, to the second coming of Jesus Christ, including the reign of Antichrist, being the little horn. Well, once we get into chapter 8 now, God kind of goes back and he focuses in on 2 of those kingdoms. But one aspect of the second kingdom that he's going to deal with is going to give us a picture, again, of the Antichrist. We're going to run into this guy who's called a little horn here. He's not the same guy as chapter 7. Chapter 7, the little horn, is the Antichrist. Here, the little horn is somebody else, but he is a forerunner of the Antichrist. He's kind of a preview, so to speak, of who the Antichrist is going to be. And we'll see that as we get going on here. But let's just kind of get into this. And I don't know how else to do this other than to read a couple verses, make a few comments, and we're going to move through the first half of this chapter quite rapidly. But notice here in verse number 1, in the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared unto me, even unto me Daniel, after that which appeared unto me at the first. Now, notice here, this is the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar. So, chapter 7 was in the 1st year of Belshazzar. This is about a year and a half, 2 years later during the reign. But chapter 7 and 8, though they come in sequence, that is not where they're at as far as the time frame of Daniel's life. Daniel chapter 7 and chapter 8 actually take place before Daniel chapter 5, if that makes sense. We talked about that some before. So in Daniel chapter 5, you remember Belshazzar's in his palace. He's throwing a party and brings in the vessels that they captured from the temple of God in Jerusalem. And they're having this party and they're praising their gods. And then this hand shows up and does this writing on the wall. Well, for some months, Babylon had been under siege by the Medo-Persians, Darius. And it was that very night that Darius was going to come into the city, and he was actually going to kill the king. But before this, he calls for Daniel to come in. Now, this is important to understand because when Daniel comes in to that party to read the handwriting on the wall, he already had Daniel chapter 7 and chapter 8. He had these two prophecies for 15 years. And they describe in these two chapters what is going to happen after Babylon. So Daniel already knows something's up. He knows this is about to be fulfilled when he goes into that party because he's been watching the siege. He knows this is the Medo-Persians. He knows literally the handwriting is on the wall for this empire, and we are about to go into the next. So when he looks at this handwriting on the wall, and you kind of get this understanding of it when you're just reading through the chapter, he almost says it glibly when he reads the handwriting and translates it and interprets it, because he knows this is already going to happen. He already had this prophecy, and so as soon as he sees the siege taking place with the Medo-Persians, he already knows, here it is. We are about to go into the next stage of this thing. So he goes in, reads the handwriting on the wall, and of course, it's no surprise to him, your days are numbered, bud. You're going down, and it's going to happen right now. And a few hours later, Darius comes into the city, kills the king, takes over, and then the rest is history, literally. But so, going in now, chapter 8, we are going to get some of the details from chapter 7. More particularly, the bear and the leopard is what it's going to focus in on. And then we are going to see that little horn. But now notice here, verse number 2, he says, "And I saw in a vision, and it came to pass when I saw that I was at Shushan," or we would know this a little bit more as Susa. You remember the story of Esther, which takes place just a little bit after this, not long after. But he's in Susa, in the palace, which is in the province of Elam. Now, Elam, that is Persia, okay, or modern-day Iran. Something else to keep in mind here, too. Well, let's just finish the verse. "And I saw in the vision, and I was by the river of Ulai." You ever wonder where Daniel was when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were in the fiery furnace? This is just personal opinion. I've never read anybody to make this connection before. I don't believe Daniel was transported in a vision to Shushan. I think that is where Daniel was stationed. So Daniel wasn't in Babylon when he wasn't in Babylon when this whole thing was going on with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He was in Shushan. That's why he didn't bow down to the idol or have to take a stand for God at that point. He wasn't there. He was a long ways away from there. But now let's go on here. So verse number 3 and 4 we see is really going to kind of begin the vision. And this is going to go down to verse number 15 and verse 15 to the end is going to give us the interpretation. So that's just kind of where we're going with it. So verse 3 and 4, we're introduced to a ram. It says, "Then I lifted up mine eyes, and I saw and behold, there stood before the river a ram which had 2 horns. And the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. And I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, so that no beast might stand before him. Neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand, but he did according to his will and became great." So just some of the details here. Notice, this ram comes on the scene. He has 2 horns, which that's not unusual. But what's unusual is the fact that one horn is longer than the other. Actually, as Daniel is seeing this, he watches as these horns come up out of his head. Now, that would be kind of an interesting sight to see. All of Daniel's visions are really interesting when you consider the implications and the details of this. But one comes up a little after the first one. So one is starting to come up out of his head. The other one then begins to come up. And the second one, as it's coming up, it passes the other one. And so now this is going to play in a little bit later, because now you remember in chapter 7, the horns represent kings and kingdoms. So Daniel already has this interpretive tool from chapter 7. And so he's going to begin to think about this. So the horns come up afterward, and then the ram is going to push west, north, and south. Now, verse 5. Verse 5, we learn about a he-goat, or a male goat. He says, "And as I was considering," so Daniel's thinking about what he just saw. And it'd probably be kind of traumatic to see this ram, and all of a sudden these horns just explode out of the top of his head, basically, what's going on. But he's considering this. He has some interpretive tools, so he's understanding these are kings that are being referred to here. What exactly does this mean? And so he's considering, and behold, an he-goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth, and touched not the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. And he came to the ram that had 2 horns, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran unto him in the fury of his power. And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler against him, and smote the ram, and brake his 2 horns, and there was no power in the ram to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground, and stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. Therefore the he-goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and for it came up 4 notable ones toward the 4 winds of the earth. So as we're looking at this goat comes on the scene, and he is going to be moving west, which from where Daniel is, that would be moving towards Turkey. And then he's going to go, he goes west, comes from the west, which would be Turkey area, or that area around Europe there. So this is where this goat is going to be coming from. And then he charges over the entire earth. He is dominating the entire globe, so to speak, or as Daniel would know it in his day, it's, we hear it often referred to as the entire known world at that time. So this goat is dominating. And he touches not the ground. The implication there is that this goat is moving so fast, his feet don't even touch the ground. He's just so swift. This is what's actually, if we go back to chapter 7, the leopard that's seen with the 4 wings, that's what's being depicted there. He doesn't run on the ground, he flies. Running would just slow him down. And that's what's happening with this goat. And he's a little different because he doesn't have 2 horns. He has 1 massive horn that comes out of the top of his head. That's just very interesting. Another detail that we get here in verse number 6 is that when he comes against this ram, it says that he is moved with choler, or anger. This is actually a retaliation that's going on here. Something has been done to this goat in time past by the ram, and so now he comes in the fury of his power. He comes with all of his might, and everything inside of him is angered against this ram. Now we understand that, you try to move something, and it's really heavy, and it's difficult, and then you get so frustrated with this thing that now that the adrenaline starts pumping, that thing's no problem to move. Now, afterwards, you might regret it, but when you're angry, you don't know your strength at that point because all the adrenaline, it just increases the strength that you have. That's what's being depicted here. This goat is coming in retaliation. He has been, something has happened to him from this ram, and so he comes against him with all of his anger, all of his fury, and he is going to greatly defeat this ram, and he's going to crush him to powder. Now, I want you to notice here at the end of verse number 7, something that's really interesting. The last phrase of that verse, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. Have you ever seen a goat with hands before? So obviously we're not talking about animals here, real animals. Daniel understands this is talking about a person of some kind. Notice now in verse number 8, it says, therefore the he-goat waxed very great. See, in verse number 4, the ram became great, and now this goat is going to wax very great. So now we understand from chapter 7, the beasts are kingdoms, the horns are kings. This goat, being a kingdom, is going to be a greater, more widespread kingdom than that of the ram. That's what we're seeing. And at the height of his greatness, notice it says there, when he was strong, the great horn was broken. At the height of his strength, not in the midst of turmoil, but all of a sudden, this horn, for no apparent reason, just breaks. And then there are 4 notable horns that come up in its place. The idea of being notable is that they're above the rest. And those 4 horns then are going to go in all 4 directions. Now, in verse number 9, and this is really where the focus of this prophecy is going to go, is he is going to begin a discussion on this little horn. Again, this is not the same little horn as we saw in chapter 7, but he is a precursor to that little horn. So this is going to become the focus of the prophecy. Notice in verse number 9. And out of one of them, out of those 4 horns, out of one of those 4 horns, came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great. So the ram became great. The goat waxed very great. Now this horn, this little horn, is going to increase even more, and he's going to become exceeding great. So again, we see this empire is what's being depicted. This kingdom is going to span out even farther than it had before. So he's very great, exceeding. And he conquers south, which would be toward Egypt. He's going to go east, which would go toward the Parthian type area. And then he's going to go north toward he's going to go then toward the pleasant land, which would be Israel. Now notice here in verse number 10. Verse 10, it says, and it waxed great even to the host, or in the scripture, in Genesis chapter 15. Remember, Abraham is told that his seed would be as the stars of heaven. So we're talking about people. In Genesis chapter 37, we find Joseph has a dream. And his mother and father there are depicted as the moon and the sun, and then his brothers are depicted as stars. So what we're getting a vision here, and we see this also in Revelation chapter 12, where it's a clear indication the woman is Israel. We are getting an indication here these are people, and particularly this host of heaven and these stars is a representation of the nation of Israel. So whoever this guy is when he comes on the scene, he is going to have a fascination with the nation of Israel. He's going to deify himself, and he is going to seek to destroy the nation. That is going to be his passion, is getting rid of the people of God. Notice verse number 11. Yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host. Now notice that's a small p. For the people of Israel, so this isn't talking about like Jesus or God, but the prince of the host, or ruler of the host, who would be considered an earthly ruler of the people of Israel? It would be the high priest. So this is who he's coming against. He's going to magnify himself even to the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of the sanctuary was cast down. So what he's going to do is he is going to kill the high priest. We'll see this in just a moment. He's going to kill the high priest. He's going to then eventually stop the sacrifices in the temple that the Jewish people are making. And the temple, it says, will be cast down. And essentially what that means is going to become useless to the Jewish people. They're not going to be able to use it for a certain period of time. It's going to be unclean to them. It's going to be, to borrow an expression from Jesus and later on even from Daniel, it is going to be the abomination of desolation. That's what they refer to it as. So why do we study this? Because Jesus says when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, whoso readeth, let him understand. So we are commanded to read the book of Daniel and to understand. So that's what this is referring to in type. Now notice verse 12. And an host was given him against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression, and it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced and prospered. So essentially what's going on here is because he stops the daily sacrifice, a war is going to ensue against him because of this. And those people that come against him, at least for a period of time, are going to be given into his hand. He's going to be allowed to overcome them for a period of time. And he's going to cast the truth to the ground. He's going to cause them to not follow the Torah. And he's going to practice, and he's going to prosper. Now, in verse number 13 and 14, we're given some additional information here, and this is kind of interesting. Then I heard one saint speaking, and another saint said unto the certain saint which spake, How long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden under foot? And he said unto me, Unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. So we're given a specific period of time that this whole event from beginning to end is going to, how long this is going to take place. From the time that this priest is killed, and within this time the temple is going to be desecrated, and then after a certain period of time it will be cleansed again. How long is this whole thing going to go? And he's given the revelation it's going to be 2,300 days, or actually it's 6 years, 4 months, and then I think a few days then after that. So that's what's going on here. And all of this is historical stuff. If you got a history book for this period of time and you looked at what's going on with Israel and what's going on with Babylon at this time and various things, this would become clear, and we'll talk about it in just a moment. And so now we come to verse number 15, the interpretation. What exactly does all this mean? And imagine seeing this all take place. I would, you ever have one of those dreams? And I know we don't put stock in dreams and stuff like that because, you could just have bad pizza or something like that and, see a 90-foot Jesus or who knows. But you ever have those dreams sometimes and it's so real, and then you wake up and you wonder, does that mean something? And it happens to me sometimes. I just wonder, because it's so realistic. And so this is what Daniel is saying. Daniel has this vision, and he's considering everything that's going on. And of course, he wants to know what this means. And so now he's about to find out. Verse number 15, it came to pass, when I, even I, Daniel, had seen the vision and sought for the meaning, then behold, there stood before me as the appearance of a man. Now he says he seeks for the meaning. How would he be able to seek for the meaning unless he had been given some sort of interpretive tools to help him along the way? See, chapter 7 is just such a tool that he's been given. And there's a lot of parallels here. We have the beast, we have horns, we have the number 4 in particular, dealing with the 4 horns. We have this idea of the little horn, Israel, the Jewish people, the number 2. So there's all these parallels that are going on to some of the things that went on in chapter 7. So Daniel's seeking for the meaning, but that prophecy doesn't have all the details that he needs. And so he says, verse 16, I heard a man's voice between the banks of Ulai, which called and said, Gabriel, make this man to understand the vision. So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid and fell upon my face. But he said unto me, Understand, O son of man, for at the time of the end shall be the vision. Now it says that there was a man, the appearance of a man that stood before him. The word for man, there's not the typical Hebrew word for man. Typically the word man is Adam or Adam is the word that is typically used. This one is, if I can pronounce it right, Gaber is how it's pronounced. And it's actually a kind of specific, and if you add L to it, you have Gaber El. So that's who this man is. When the voice calls out Gabriel, give him the interpretation, explain it to him. This man that was standing with him was Gabriel. And it's interesting because you hear people say, I saw an angel and I just felt such peace and a calm came over me and I felt so relaxed. Well, what's Daniel's problem? Daniel sees this angel and he falls down and about has a heart attack standing in the presence of this angel. Never mind. Anyway, so Gabriel is the one that is going to give him the interpretation. And it's interesting because there's 3 key phrases that are here in this verse 17, that are 17 and also in 19, and we'll read that are going to help us to understand there is a double interpretation for this little horn and who he is. So let's look at this. So verse 17, so he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid, fell upon my face, but he said unto me, Understand, O son of man, now listen, for at the time of the end shall be the vision. Now as he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep, on my face toward the ground, but he touched me and set me upright. And he said unto me, and he said, Behold, I will make thee know what shall be, notice this, in the last end of the indignation. For at the time appointed, the end shall be. Now, as we look at this, we're going to see that these visions have to do with the Medo-Persians and the Grecians, those 2 empires. But you and I both know we are a long time since the Grecians were ever an empire in this world. So has this prophecy been entirely fulfilled? Was that the time of the end? Obviously, we know the answer to that is no. And these expressions are going to be used elsewhere. Look over at chapter 9. I'm going to try to hurry up and finish this up because chapter 9 is really where I'm wanting to get. Chapter 9 is probably the most important chapter as far as Bible prophecy is concerned in the entire Bible. But chapter 9, notice in verse number 26. So we're dealing with Daniel's 70 weeks here. And in chapter 9, verse 26, And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And notice this. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood. Now notice this. And unto the end of the war desolations are determined. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. That sounds almost exactly like what chapter 8 is saying about this little horn. Almost. But you see, there's a lot of similarity. He's using the exact same expressions to refer to an event that took place after the time of Christ. And actually is still yet to take place at the time of the end. He talks about the oblation ceasing, the temple being desolate, until the end, the consummation, the appointed time. We also learn here that this prince that shall come, who we understand as the Antichrist, he is going to come from the same people that destroyed the sanctuary or the temple. And that was the Romans that did that. Well, the little horn in chapter 8 is Grecian. So Antichrist, this little horn, is not the Antichrist, but we see as we look at these that he is a precursor to the Antichrist. Notice over Daniel chapter 11. Daniel chapter 11 is going to go into a lot of detail about this little horn in chapter number 8. But drop down to verse 21 to 34 talks about in detail a man named Antiochus Epiphanes. That's who this little horn is in Daniel chapter 8. We'll see that in just a moment in more detail. But if you notice verse 31, it says, "And arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength," it's talking about Antiochus Epiphanes, "and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate." So that's what's being talked about with this little horn in Daniel chapter number 8. But now keep going. Drop down to verse number 35. In verse number 35, we find a transition that takes place in this description. Because up to this point, everything that's it's saying about Antiochus Epiphanes, he fulfilled it to a T. In fact, there's many, obviously, liberal scholars that say, well, Daniel wasn't written by Daniel. It was written by a pseudo-Daniel in the 300s because there's no way Daniel could have pinpointed all of this information so exact as to get this right had he been before the time. Well, he could, because Daniel didn't write this. This didn't come from Daniel's imagination and experience. This came from the hand of God, who knows the end from the beginning. But here in verse number 35, a transition begins to take place, but it's talking about somebody like Antiochus Epiphanes. Notice, it says, "And some of them of understanding shall fall, to try them and to purge and to make them white, even to the," here it is, "time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed." So now he's telling Daniel, look, this Antiochus guy that I just described to you, there's some details I'm going to give you now about a guy like him that is for an appointed time. It is for something farther on down the road after him. And so we see there, verse 36. It says, "And the king shall do according to his will. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished. For that is determined shall be done." That's exactly what he's talking about in Daniel chapter 8. If you drop down to verse number 40, it says, "And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north." So you're going to have Egypt going to war against him, and Russia is going to try to get involved on this thing. "And shall come against him like a whirlwind with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships. He shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over." So I think we're probably getting a bit of a description there of what World War III is going to look like as that's beginning. But if you drop down to verse number 45, verse 45 says that he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the sea in the glorious holy mountain. This is not something that Antiochus Epiphanes did. But this is something we are told is going to happen with the Antichrist. Sometime during his campaign, he will come through Israel at the midpoint of the tribulation period. He's going to come through Israel, and he is going to set up his palace in the exact same place that the temple is. The rebuilt temple. That's what he's describing here. Now listen to what he says. Yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. Now, what do we know takes place in the midpoint of the tribulation period? He's going to be killed, or at least it's going to look like he's killed. And he's going to resurrect, or at least he's going to look like he resurrected, and he's going to be indwelt by Satan. And that's when the great tribulation begins against the people of Israel. Daniel chapter 12, verse 1, at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince, which stand for the children of thy people, and there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even at the same time, and at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. So this is all getting detailed out for Daniel as we go through this. And so as we go back now to Daniel chapter 8, and I try to wrap this up here real quick, he is going to explain this, that this prophecy has a near and a far fulfillment. It is going to be a near fulfillment in the person of Antiochus Epiphanes. And we see prophecies like this throughout the Scripture. God talks about, out of Egypt have I called my son. Well, when he gives that prophecy, initially in the Old Testament, he's talking about the nation of Israel being delivered in the Exodus. But when the gospel writers apply it, they apply it to Jesus Christ. So there is a near and a far fulfillment. We have with the expression, the day of the Lord. You read through the prophets, and they mention the day of the Lord is near. It's dark and gloomy, and there's fire and all these different things, and chariots and horsemen, and all these different things going on, and they're going to destroy the people. Well, it's depicting, in a near sense, a battle against the nation of Israel, or a battle against another king. But then there is a far fulfillment in the future day of the Lord when it actually comes. We also see this same type of thing go on with in Ezekiel chapter 28. We have the prince of Tyrus being spoken about and how he's going to be destroyed and be brought down to hell. But then we understand also reading that, well, he's not so much just talking about Tyrus, but the power behind Tyrus, Satan himself. But Satan hasn't been taken to hell yet, but he will be in the future. So there's near and far fulfillments. So notice here, verse number 20, and we'll try to wrap this up. I think I can do it here pretty quick. The ram which thou sawest, having two horns, are the kings of Media and Persia. So that's pretty simple. The Medes and the Persians. The one horn, remember, came up last, but it surpassed the other horn, and that's because Media was first, but the Persians came up last, and they joined ranks with Media, but the Persians actually became more powerful. Remember, Cyrus was or Darius was a Persian. And we see that he also is represented by the bear in Daniel chapter 7 that has the three ribs, depicting the three directions he's going to go. He's going to go west toward Babylon and Mesopotamia, north toward the Caspian Sea and the Russian type area there, and then south toward Egypt. Verse 21. And the rough goat, or the shaggy goat, is the king of Grecia. And the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Now that being broken, whereas four stood up for it, four kingdoms shall stand up, one out of the nation, but not in his power. So this Grecian Empire, it's interesting because the Grecian Empire, for their flag, had at that time, their standard that they took into battle, had a goat on it. Also is referred to as Aegea, the Aegean area, Greece was. So you have like the Aegean Sea. Aegea means goat. I don't even want to know how it got that name for a sea, because that you probably don't want to swim in it. So you don't vacation there, it stinks. But this horn that's going to come out of him, this great horn, it says is the first king. Well, this is Alexander the Great. He's not touching the ground because he's swift, and he exceeds in power. And it's interesting because he was given the kingdom at the age of 20, and by the age of 30, he had conquered the known world at that time. In fact, he fell on his bed at the end of his last battle crying because there's no more worlds to conquer. I can't imagine being a world dictator at the age of 30 years old. I'm a little behind, I guess. But he died at the height of his power. That's why he says, at his strength, the horn is broken. He's at the height of his power, and that's when he dies. And then when he dies, he said that his kingdom is supposed to go to the mightiest. Well, it ended up going to his 4 generals, or those 4 horns. And we saw in verses 6 and 7 that there's going to be a war that takes place between this goat and the ram. Well, Greece had a number of years before come in and had, the Medes had come into Greece attacking them and had really kind of decimated them. And so now by this time, they are extremely angry. There has been a lot of anger. There's been a lot of hostility, a lot of hard feelings between the Grecians and the Persians. And Alexander the Great was exceeding swift in his attack because he went with a very small army. And you would think if somebody's going to conquer the world, he had to have had a massive army to do so. He had 35,000 soldiers that he took with him. Just a massive feat for such a small group of people. In fact, when he finally defeats the Persians, he is going up with those 35,000 people. He is going up against an army of 1 million soldiers. That's insane. Now, he was smart the way he did it because he directs his soldiers around the Medes. He comes in from the back, assassinates Xerxes, and or Darius III assassinates him, and that's how they defeat the army. But nonetheless, I think if I was going up against 1 million people, I might think I'm a little bit outnumbered. But Alexander didn't care. In fact, it says that he was going not in his own power. There was something else driving him and motivating him. Now let's look at this little horn here real quick and we'll be done. So verse 23 through verse 26 explain this little horn. He is going to come from one of those 4 generals, one of those 4 horns. So now remember the near and far fulfillment. So this is about Antiochus Epiphanes, and he's really a small preview of the Antichrist when he comes. In verse 9, he's called the little horn. He comes from one of those 4 horns. And actually, Antiochus comes from his great-grandfather was Seleucus, one of the generals of Alexander the Great. Now let's read this here, verse 23. And in the latter time of their kingdom, or of those 4 horns, when the transgressors are come to the full, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall stand up. His power shall be mighty, but not of his own power, and he shall destroy wonderfully, and shall prosper and practice, and shall destroy the mighty and the holy people. And through his policy also he shall cause craft to prosper in his hand, and he shall magnify himself in his heart, and by peace shall destroy many. He shall also stand up against the prince of princes. Now, who's the prince of princes there? Capital P, that's Jesus Christ himself. But he shall be broken without hand. And the vision of the evening and the morning which was told is true. Wherefore shut thou up the vision, for it shall be for many days. And I, Daniel, fainted and was sick certain days. Afterward I rose up and did the king's business, and I was astonished at the vision, but none understood it. So let me just read this here real quick. Back in verse number 10, we're told how he cast down the host and the stars. So after Antiochus Epiphanes defeated Egypt, he comes into, actually he was defeated in Egypt. He comes to Israel on his way home, and because he has this grudge, he decides he wants to kill the Jewish leaders, and he decides he wants to kill 40,000 Jews. Just really for no apparent reason. He just slaughters these people because he thinks they're weak. He takes 10,000 of them slave. Now, September 6, 171, he murders the high priest, and he installs a false priesthood. Now, a little bit later, on his birthday, this is kind of ironic, December 25th, in 167, he stops the temple sacrifices. Inside the temple, he puts up an idol of Zeus, and then he sacrifices a pig on the altar, and he takes and presents the blood in the temple. So this desecrates the temple. The temple can't be used by the Jews anymore. Now it's unclean. And this we understand if you, I don't recommend reading the Catholic Bible, but if you have ever read the Catholic Bible, you know there's 1st or 2nd Maccabees in there. But that depicts this period of time in history where there was the Maccabean revolt. The family of the Maccabees stood up to Antiochus Epiphanes. And for a little while, they were having a hard time. But then after 3 years, Antiochus is off somewhere else, and he dies. But he doesn't die by the hand of anybody. He dies insane. Now, he named himself Epiphanes, or Epiphanius, and which means glorious one. So he is, in a sense, magnifying himself to the Prince of Princes himself. But the people actually refer to him as Epimenides, which means madman, because he was crazy, and that's exactly how he dies. But what's interesting is from the time he comes into the city and kills that priest is exactly 2,300 days, as the prophecy says, until at his death they go in and they cleanse the temple. And that's when they resume their temple sacrifices again. And it's at that time they celebrate Hanukkah, or the Feast of Lights, which, it's interesting, Jesus celebrates it in John chapter 10. But now, notice here, let me just real quickly go over this. So let me show you the parallels here between him and the Antichrist, because there's going to be quite a few of them. So when he comes, he's going to come in the latter time of the kingdom, and transgressors are going to be to the full. When Antiochus Epiphanes came, there was great apostasy among God's people in Israel. He was a king of fierce countenance. He understood dark sayings, which means that he was a genius. He understood things that other people didn't understand. He had power, and he had tremendous abilities, and his power was diverse. He had abilities he was kind of a jack of all trades, so to speak. He operated not of his own power. He had mind-blowing destruction of people wherever he went, and he succeeded in nearly crushing the Jewish people. He is a political leader, according to verse number 25. He talks about his policy. He's going to magnify himself, where he refers to himself as the glorious one, or Epiphanes. And without hand, he is going to die. So in essence, it's going to appear that as he dies from natural causes. But now, here's how he's kind of a precursor to the Antichrist, the little horn of chapter 7. Because the Antichrist is going to come at a time of great apostasy, according to Paul. Israel is going to be in the land. He is going to be very intelligent. He's going to be satanically empowered. He's going to be a military leader. He's going to plan to destroy the nation of Israel. He's going to invoke peace with many. And he's going to desecrate the temple. He's going to stand against the Prince of Princes, and he will be destroyed by divine judgment without hand. Because we read there in Revelation chapter 19, when he comes and he casts the beast and the false prophet into the lake of fire, he doesn't have to lay a hand on him. It's just the spirit of his mouth that destroys the enemies. So anyway, so that's Antiochus Epiphanes, that's Little Horn. And then once we get into chapter 9, it's going to pick up, and there's a lot more prophecy, and we'll see how this stuff works out in the future. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this.